Hello again, Steve here with a few comments again about what I think about what's happening and what's inevitable to happen in the great, and I say very great, United States experiment in human emancipation. I think this is important for freedom if we can learn something from what's going on. And I'm going to call this How the Republic is Lost. Now, I happen to believe that just from not so much belief as an empty belief, but a belief from some sort of study that I have done, that there has been no greater expression, and maybe there have been great expressions in the past, but no greater expression, I don't think, in human freedom than the American experiment. Some have termed it American exceptionalism. Stemming from that has been the American dream, I guess. And there, from the very inception of this American experiment, there have been forces at work to take it out, because the greatest threat to those who want to profit off of human slavery is a free human being in societies, right? Free human beings, for sure. Now, what I see is that, in early Americas, the early founding fathers, or the people who were talking a lot about, the enlightened people who were talking about this experiment we can't kid ourselves, this was a long drawn out experiment. This didn't happen overnight by just somebody announcing independence. This was a long battle that was fought for years in the bushes and so on against the controlling forces by people who had fled Europe to try to be free, right? And there was many disparate communities all over what became the Americas, became the United States of America, rather. And they were largely rural or small communities. And in fact, I forget which guy it was, said Jefferson, or one of these guys, he said that basically, there will come a time when cities will be west of the Mississippi, and that'll be the ruination of society, maybe, unless people rise up again, because cities mess up the minds of humanity, because they lose their sense of self-reliance, and they start to live off of graft and so on, because there's so much less human contact, you might say, or whatever, in cities. But they lose self-reliance. When you have self-reliance, there's this sense of work, this work ethic, and the reliance on other people and so on, rather than trying to steal from them, which is what's happening so much now, I would say. And and there was an understanding at the time that only those who were responsible in a community could decide the destiny of that community. So in the early America, the ones who voted were landowning men. I mean, at the time, women weren't considered to be responsible enough. I mean, we could argue that till the cow come home. I think that's a little bit outdated, for sure, to say the least. But the land owning aspect of it had great rationale even today, because only those who own something or produce something, you could argue, are the ones who should have say on what the money that is being taken from them is spent on. So why somebody who doesn't pay in has a say in what the expenses are is astounding to me. So in the early days, it was the voting, my understanding of the way the Republic worked. It was one reason why it was so exceptional in American exceptionalism, that the Republic was a upside down system. So the individuals within the society were sovereign, or those who they weren't citizens. There was no such thing as citizen at the time. They were sovereigns, you might say. And the so-called, what you'd call leaders, presidents, governors, and these sorts of things, were servants of the sovereigns. It was completely flipped upside down, whereas the system they had fought to escape from was top down. You had the sovereign, or the king, at the top, and all the minions below. They flipped that upside down and said, okay, we, the people, are sovereign, and you, all those servants, those who go into public service, are our servants, right? And so in the early days, it was a government of delegates, and the delegate was the one sent to the state house, or in time the federal house, to do the bidding of those from that community. And they also elected a sheriff. And of course, because a sovereign, one who is sovereign, has the right to defend his or her property, right? His or her life, liberty, and property, which is the origin of that concept. But because the delegation of efforts leads to, one individual is farming, one's a merchant, and so on. So let's all pool together and hire somebody who's a professional defender of our property and life and so on. We'll call him the sheriff, or the shire reeve, right? That's where that comes from. But in time, as you can see, anybody who's given power in some way in a community, corruption creeps in. So in time, there's the concept, okay, let's delegate an overseer, because all these little communities have a sheriff. Let's have an overseer of these sheriffs to make sure there's no rogue sheriffs from within. So you have, for example, the state police, right? And they oversee everything for the state, make sure all the sheriffs are following the policies that everybody's agreed upon. But then what happens is corruption creeps into there, because corrupt people are always going to want to seek positions of power, right? And whenever you give monopoly of force, monopoly of power to an individual, say in this region we're going to give this sheriff's department the monopoly on violence to kick anybody out of here who doesn't behave. Well, that's very tempting for a corrupt individual to get in there and gain personal power. And the same thing on the state level. So there's this creeping ever desire to put another overseer. So then you see federal marshals put in place to try to oversee the state police. And then FBI, we saw that in the South where police were embedded with mistreating of blacks and so on. So the Federal Bureau of Investigation go down there and try to sort that out. So now they're the seers of the seers. And then that didn't seem to be enough, so then you add on Homeland Security or something like this. But none of it ever works, because the concept is, of course, when you have this this allowance of ever creeping of government, is you always have you start to grow a dependent class, because voting, when you delegate the franchise, and this is another thing that happened, is that this concept of federal citizen came about in the 1700s that never existed before. And now everybody has the franchise of vote. So what happens is those who produce nothing into the pot have the same vote as somebody who produces a huge amount into the pot. So the politicians, and once again, the crooks who enter this system, will pander to those who don't pay into it and say, we're going to give you something. And they'll vote for them. But how do they give? Because government owns nothing. They only give by taking from others. The redistribution, right? So this is the beginning of the end. Once everybody has the vote, it is the beginning of the end. And what's the solution? Well, the solution du jour, it seems to be, is to vote for somebody who's going to roll it back. So Donald Trump comes along, who, incidentally, seems to be an absolute force of nature. The guy is just absolutely amazing and successful at what he does. And you can see the backlash that's going on with the special interests who are invested in the status quo of keeping the dependent welfare classes going, and keeping the military-industrial complex going, and keeping the Wall Street industrial complex and the media industrial complex, all of those things going, this corporate and individual welfare system going, vote buying, high immigration from third world populations who typically vote socialist because they've never come from a free environment and they'll just always vote for goodies. All of this there's huge amounts of special interest packed into making sure Donald Trump doesn't get in. So what will Donald Trump do, though? Donald Trump, of course, being a force of nature, is not something that you can just roll out of a local parking lot. He is once in a millennium, perhaps, or once in a generation for sure, a phenomenon that can come along and actually have the potential along with all of the other things being in place, a whole raft of people who are really pissed off at what has been going on and being fleeced, and also the amazing phenomenon of the alternative media through the internet to expose all the corruption and lies and so on that have gone on for so long within this system. You have that potential for him to get in and roll things back. But, and here's the big but, and here's why it comes down to how the Republic is lost and doomed to be lost, is because if he is effective in rolling things back, which that remains hugely doubtful in many ways, how long is he going to be around for? A couple terms, basically, and then it's going to be back to what? Eventually, this is all going to creep back in again, and there's going to be another department needed to oversee the new overseers, and then eventually another department needed to oversee that one, and then eventually, $20 trillion in debt. I mean, how are you going to pay that off? It's, and not only that, there is a historical precedence for empires falling. And I don't mean this to be deterministic necessarily. There's always the potential for history to be different, no question about it. And this may be the time when this will happen. Maybe things will actually get sorted out. Maybe Donald Trump will, through the will of the people, turn things around and make things the way they were supposed to be according to the Constitution of the United States. But I have my doubts, because people at the end of the day want freedom, and more people are waking up to the lack of freedom that exists in any governmental system. Remember, governmental means the control of the mind, right? If you want to look at it that way. And more and more people are tired of having mind control of any time, of any sort. And don't forget, Donald Trump is a statist and will probably remain a statist. And there's going to be people who reject even what he thinks, and he does. And I think it's going to devolve back into the devolution of the Republic that had such great promise, and we'll go back to its demise. But from that, hopefully, there is enough time lapse that enough people figure out ways to have voluntary societies, to have peaceful parenting, to have and grow a community of people who have the strength of family values, getting along with other people, free enterprise, and all of this which can exist in spite of the state, right? And if we can get to that point, then the Republic is doomed, but society is not doomed. We can get along, we can voluntarily get along and have a better life here on Earth. How about that for quality of life improvement? Steve here again, great chatting. Talk again soon. Bye for now.